Hi, friends. Welcome to another edition of Beyond the Clouds Edge-to-Edge Transformation. It's always a joy for me to talk to people I've known for some time who have done amazing things. And Wally Rhines did amazing things in the electronic design space. Uh, Wally, tell us a little bit about you to our audience. Most people know you here.
Yeah, well, I've been in semiconductors most of my professional career. That started really in graduate school, and I worked on 3.5 semiconductor compounds. And actually, the advisor I worked with most was Craig Barrett, who became CEO at Intel, and he was a professor back then. And I went to work for Texas Instruments and was there for 21 years, and he eventually ran the worldwide semiconductor business, which today is the only business. Back then, it was only about half the company. And then left in late 1993, and joined a very troubled company at the time, Mentor Graphics, and I was CEO there for 23 years, and it was eventually acquired by Siemens. And so I began doing other things. And so today I'm CEO of a small company that has solved a very important problem, making fully homomorphic encryption a reality. And so while the company is based on very unique compiler software, we're also designing a chip to implement it. So it's a full-time job, but I still stay connected with the industry and with other companies through boards and things like that.
Wally, it is amazing to me. You joined Mentor Graphics at a time when Falcon was going nowhere, and the nearest competitors, Cadence and Synopsys, were like, "Oh, there's no future for the company." And then the moment uh, it was announced that you were going to take over Mentor, I remember I was at Cadence at that time. It sent chills through our management. So how did you turn around this company? I remember the Falcon framework and everything was going through all kinds of things.
Well, yeah, my the CEO of TI, Jerry Junkins, a wonderful person, and he told me that he had gotten the CEO position uh, later in life at age 55, and he was going to be there 10 years. And he actually said, "I'd recommend you should get a CEO job somewhere." But I couldn't really interview publicly because I had a very visible position at TI. But Mentor was clearly in trouble, and I knew they were in trouble. But the thing that impressed me was that as a customer, Mentor had gone the extra mile to make sure that their problems with the new software framework didn't affect our business, and they had added all sorts of application engineers. And so what I figured is any company can have technical problems and bounce back. What you can't do is bounce back from lack of integrity, where you just dump your customers when you have a problem and move on. And so I thought it was a company that had integrity, although version 8.0, the Falcon framework you're talking about, had been sort of euphemistically named version late.slow. And actually, it was supposed to be the future of the company, and it actually never actually emerged, remained the future until it finally was dropped.
Wow, I still remember those days. And I first met you at the User Society of Electronic Design Automation. And it was amazing how this EDA industry at that time was almost unknown to Wall Street. Uh, it was like, oh, they do some esoteric stuff, remember? And
Oh yeah,
today, it's considered one of the most important industries. How did that transformation happen over decades?
well, first of all, it through most of my career at TI, we developed our own design automation tools. I even had that group report to me, and in fact, the reason that Bangalore is here today as such a center is because we couldn't hire the software engineers to develop our EDA software fast enough. So we sought out places, and we discovered Bangalore and started the first major semiconductor operation there, developing EDA software. And so I think the investment community knew that the companies can do this themselves, and so third parties are going to have trouble. But the fact was that the semiconductor industry was fragmenting. There are more and more companies, and they couldn't all afford to do their own EDA software. And then the economies of scale started piling up, where if someone had a tool that was used by dozens of companies, the tool became better, more efficient, more cost effective than one that a company could develop by itself and try to popularize. So that obscured the importance of EDA for quite some time, and it had not yet become apparent to people that once engineers adopted a tool, that they were very reluctant to change. So it was a business that had stickiness that I don't think the investment community appreciated. So when you got a revenue stream, it tended to be a stable one. And the last thing was that as this gradual transition occurred to third-party tools, the investment community recognized that there really aren't that many qualified designers in the world. So even if you had the best tool, you're limited in market because there are only tens of thousands of designers who could ever buy it. So unlike the semiconductor market, where you develop a great chip and you can sell $1 billion worth, EDA was one with a limit, and so it just didn't seem like a very good investment back in that period of time. And that was really before the big software companies emerged as well.
Yeah, it's a totally different industry now. I read your resume for the first time this week in preparation for this interview. And I was surprised to find out that you're a captain in the US Army. Can you tell us how or in what ways your Army training helped you or how shaped your career and how it helped you work on difficult problems like you've always done?
So I've long since retired, but I do think that junior officers in the military make very good managers in business because you're with very little experience at all, you're suddenly responsible for a platoon of 30 or 40 people, and they are not superstars. They are average at best. And so you're dealing with a wide variety of societal problems as well as having to fulfill a very specific mission with strong metrics. And so I think it's a very good training. I think people coming out of the military make very good managers. And in fact, it's been true. If you look at companies, it's a good source of hiring.
In fact, Ross Perot himself was a military person,
He
right?
was Navy,
One of the
yes.
most renowned executives and presidential candidate as well.
But his initial success was not managing people. It was because he refused to take no for an answer, and he called on 150 companies before he sold his first software product. And the only reason he even formed EDS as a company was because he had exceeded the maximum sales commissions at IBM uh, by in January of the year, and there was no upside, so he left the company. So there are some really exceptional people that are very driven, and I've had the pleasure of knowing quite a few of them. Yeah, Michael Dell's another one like that. Just amazing. Whatever he attacks, he has a natural nose for success.
And now that we are going through very interesting geopolitical times, what do you think about the US CHIPS Act? Is it going to turn around the semiconductor industry and bring manufacturing back, or what will it take to make this successful?
Well, the CHIPS Act, I think, will have its biggest impact on rejuvenating university research, which has been starved by the biological sciences for the last 20 years. And this gives a stimulus for funding to get students interested, get professors interested. That's likely to be the biggest benefit, even though it's a small part of the dollars. The national, NSTC is just 10 or 11 billion of the total 50 billion or so. Bringing back manufacturing is a different issue, and that's a difficult one. Whether it has an impact or not, I don't know. The problem being that the manufacturing industries don't change quickly. And so, if you really wanted to make the US a powerhouse in semiconductor manufacturing, you would fund TSMC to have a parallel track in the US for developing leading edge processes. And even that would be, even with funding, that would be difficult for them, although they'd be more than willing to do it. But we probably don't have enough engineers in the US to do that in a short period of time. For US companies to get back in the manufacturing business when they become heavily dependent on sourcing in foreign countries that have uh, relatively low cost of engineering, a relatively plentiful supply compared to the US, much fewer environmental regulations, other costs, and so on. That's a big challenge. I think it'll have some impact. I think the best part of it is that they've targeted new emerging technologies and new materials to encourage investment in the U.S. But to get traditional businesses to move back to the U.S., I think the thing that is most likely to make that happen is if Taiwan comes under threat from China. As long as Taiwan is a secure source of supply, I think it's difficult to compete in the foundry business. And then in other parts of the semiconductor business, there are lots of sources as well. So at best, it would be a multi-decade transition, and more likely it's a temporary stimulus.
Yeah, yeah, so much is happening all at the same time. Speaking of which, tell us a little bit about your new venture, Konami. Sounds
Oh,
very
yes.
exciting.
So this one is really exciting. Cornami is named for a tsunami of cores. It's multi-core computing.
Ah,
And it was founded about 10 years ago. Gordy Campbell was the original. Gordy's famous for founding Chips and Technologies and 3DFX and a variety of very successful semiconductor companies. And it was based on reconfigurable computing and what you could do in software to take advantage of it. And they developed the team, really three core people, developed a software approach and compiler technology that allowed them to compile any arbitrary application written in C into totally independent streams of control and data. And they then were able to accelerate it because if the streams are independent, then the more streams you have, the faster the application runs if they are truly parallel. And they found that running them on Intel and NVIDIA computers, they could provide acceleration, but it was not that large, and people were reluctant uh, to commit to a sole source supplier of a particular methodology and compiler. So they decided to do a chip, and that chip would be a share nothing architecture that could process the independent streams independently, run them through systolic arrays, and allow linear acceleration with the number of cores. And then they got a very clever designer who designed a very, very small core. So their initial chips have thousands of cores, and that's at 16 nanometers. They can go up to tens of thousands of cores. And they've been running benchmarks now for several years. Now they have full emulation, and the technology is proving it can do what was promised. So yes, it can be used to accelerate machine learning, but more importantly, it's going to solve a problem that no one else has been able to solve, and that's the future of encryption, the future of data protection, all of which comes down to being able to process data while it's encrypted. And the only known way to do that is with fully homomorphic encryption, invented at Stanford University by Craig Gentry in 2009. And right now, it's not really practical because it's very slow. But you can imagine with parallel streams of processing, you can accelerate it on with Cornami software and hardware to whatever speed you want. So you can speed it up a million X if you want, and that makes it competitive with processing data on in unencrypted form. and it's just in time because quantum computers are going to break most of the security on the internet. So the world will have to go to something new. The choice of the US government is fully homomorphic encryption. The choice of most companies that worry about data security is to adopt fully homomorphic encryption. So it will be a big, very important transition that will generate a lot of revenue over the next decade.
Wow, you have so many things going on at the startup, from a tsunami, of course, systolic arrays, neural networks, and homomorphic encryption, as well as linear acceleration. Now, it is very exciting, obviously, but as you know, when you have two or three dimensions to success, the complexity goes up and the chances of risk goes up too. In what ways are you folks mitigating risk as you develop the company to be this
Yes.
multi-billion-dollar company?
Good point. Don't take any risks you don't have to. So one of the things I did when I joined the company is to focus everything on a single application, fully homomorphic encryption, rather than chasing machine learning and other things, although we can easily do that with the chips we've designed. And then the second risk reduction was to go with a very conservative process. So it's 16 nanometer TSMC, very mature, very stable, very well characterized. But if you have a design that can be accelerated just by adding more chips, you don't have to use the most advanced process. So 16 nanometer was fine. We could do thousands of cores per chip, and we chose that. And actually, the chip itself is just an array of tiles that can be reconfigured in software, and the data flows through. There's no interdependency, there's no shared memory, there's no synchronization. So it's really a fairly, I can't say simple design, but it's a very straightforward design. And so the risk there is much smaller than most chip design companies.
Besides your operating roles, you have also advised many companies, served on their boards. I remember in the good old days, Cirrus Logic, all the way to Global Logic. And also, you're an advisor at Silicon Catalyst, and you run a SPAC. Do you have any advice for entrepreneurs and people who run small companies? Because we are in very interesting times with this whole AI, machine learning, generative, and all. What single piece of advice can you give them as to how to make small ventures successful?
Well, you've mentioned some. Minimize the risk, maximize the focus, pick a market and a set of technologies that you can move quickly to discover whether the application is going to be successful, and then you can modify your path ahead to make adjustments for where demand ends up emerging. One of the big challenges is fundraising, and that was a big challenge for me. I'd never had to worry about that at TI or Mentor Graphics, and so I had to go find people who were religiously excited about the possibilities that fully homomorphic encryption could bring. And I found one of those, Eric Chen. Believes this is one of the changes that will change the world over the next 100 years, and he was uh, one of the major funders or portfolio managers for SoftBank. And so SoftBank led a round of funding that was sufficient to get us the money to get to a product. And so that was a big help, but that was not easy. I spent the better part of 2 years. I've talked to just about every venture capitalist in the U.S. and many not in the U.S. In search of this, and it takes a person of imagination, willing to tolerate the risk of a pre-revenue company. This SoftBank doesn't invest in pre-revenue companies. We were, I believe, the first, and so somebody has to step out on a limb. And I think from the really successful startups, uh, people take a fair amount of risk in something they believe in, and it turns out to be a much bigger reward than if you simply do an incremental improvement to some product or technology in the market.
Indeed, indeed. In fact, Wally, you've had some spectacular successes in your career. Which particular project or assignment do you consider was the most interesting or the most challenging in your career? If you
So,
were to pick one.
so this is an interesting aspect I've observed that I think a lot of your listeners might want to know about, and that is the more desperate the situation that I was put in, the more innovative and satisfying was the subsequent solution. So the most desperate, well, there were two. You mentioned one was Mentor, but actually, my first really big one was when I was put in charge of the microprocessor group at TI in 1978. Intel had just announced the 8086. The Motorola 68000 was disclosed. The Z8000 was coming out, and TI had a 16-bit microprocessor that only had 16 bits of logical address space and was clearly not going to be competitive. So no one wanted the job. So a 30-year-old could be appointed to run a division that would be normally much too big a responsibility. And that's when, after assessing the situation, we decided that we have to look ahead. And that's when we said, gee, if general purpose host microprocessors are the big thing today, maybe in the future, special purpose microprocessors will be. And we did four of them, one for digital signal processing or communications, one for graphics, one for mass storage, and one for local area networks. And they all had some success, but really the DSP, the first really successful digital signal processor, was the biggest. And eventually, it and its derivatives became about half of TI's total revenue. So, very satisfying, but a very desperate situation. When I got the job, the only reason I was even interested was because I was living in Lubbock, Texas, running the consumer products engineering group, and I wanted to get out of Lubbock, and so this was a way to do it. But I I was amazed that we were as successful as we were.
So you have again had many successes, but as we all know, failure is inevitable. And how did you handle failure if you ever failed in any project? Because most people only hear of the success stories. That's what marketing is all about, right? How do you handle failure, and how, did failure play a role in your success?
Well, failure and missed opportunities, things that could have been done differently that weren't. Uh, I think the most important thing is to learn from those failures. And so there were many times when I had to assess, what had gone wrong. There were, I think, example of missed opportunity was when I was at Mentor early on, and the uh, there was a company, CCT, that had developed, they'd been former Mentor employees. They had developed a terrific printed circuit board router, and we were OEMing the product and doing very well with it. And they were going to do an IPO, and they came to us and said, look, we owe everything to you, and your OEM business is 90% of our sales. Uh, the IPO will generate about $60 million. We think we should offer ourselves to sale for you for sale for about the same amount. And it was a difficult period for Mentor. Our stock price was low. We didn't have that much cash. And I said, look, it's a great relationship. Let's just continue after you become public. And so they said, fine. This is John Cooper and David Chen. And so they started to do the IPO, and Cadence came in and bought them for $450 million. And then came back to us and said, that OEM you're doing for the printed circuit board routing, we're going to cancel it at the end of the 1 year period, which your contract calls for. So good luck getting a new router. And so it created an enormous headache for something. The 60 million could easily have been handled. I should have realized how important they were to us, but I didn't. I overlooked it. Big mistake. And so in the future times, I looked at where do you have dependencies that are really critical to your company, and what are you doing to protect those dependencies or to remove your dependency, one or the other. But be careful, because if you can think of a competitive move that would cause great damage, it probably will happen sooner or later.
Wow, wow. That I remember Cooper and Chan and the acquisition by Cadence. That was a long time ago, but I also remember that as how Cadence got into the PC business in a very formidable way. So,
It was a big help, yeah.
yeah, changing topics. The first person who even mentioned your name to me was Karen Bartleson. And as you know, Karen in those days was with the User Society of EDA. She worked for you and later became the president of IEEE. Today happens to be Women in Engineering Day, which is June 23rd. Uh, what do you think is happening? We still have only 14% or less than 1 in 6 women are engineers. And there are Karen Bartlesons out there who have done amazing things. There's Lisa Su, nobody needs an introduction to her, running AMD. What do you think is, how do you think is changing and should it change? What do you think?
Well, we're all very proud of what Karen Bartleson has done. And I might add Lisa Su. They both got their start at TI. Uh,
Wow, I did not
Very
know
few
that.
people know that Lisa Su worked at TI in those years. But so I've known her for a long time. And Karen was in design automation, developing software for EDA. So they both were outstanding new top people. But I think the problem you point to today for women in engineering was we have decades of production of a too small a percentage of women engineers. Now that has certainly changed at leading universities. Now most of them have more women in engineering than they do men, and so the problem is solving itself in one way, which is simply supply versus demand. And so the numbers improve at a rapid level. But the other thing I think that organizations are trying to address is the willingness for companies to aggressively hire women into engineering positions. And there can be lots of reasons. You know, if they don't have good childcare in their company, sometimes they lose women employees to raise their children. If they don't have you know, a structure that knows how to have interaction in decision making, they can suffer. But I think all that is becoming less and less of a problem. And for those of us in the business, this is an enormous resource. Think about when I started in the industry, you had basically half the population was not available to you as potential contributors. And over time, we have essentially doubled the possibilities as women enter the whole educational workforce chain. But it goes all the way back to women in grade school, and are they getting the right start with mathematics and science that they can go into engineering? And for many of them, they get to junior high school or high school and the doors are already closed. There's no reopening them if you've gotten behind on the math track. So I think the things people are doing in K through 12 are very, very important to opening up that pipeline, not only for women, but for all sorts of underrepresented minorities and others. Creating that opportunity will uncover all sorts of creative people who otherwise would not be able to make the major contributions that they could have.
You mentioned the role of integrity and values, and you said that integrity is essential for you to look at how to turn around a company. A lot of people seem to not believe in that. They think that it's all about making money. Uh, Tell us about what you see the most important values that a company needs to be successful and ethical. What is it that you look for when you're looking at a company?
As I mentioned before, integrity is something you have to build from the ground up. So if you're starting a company and the founders are simply focused on success at any cost, then probably you'll instill those values in the people you hire as you grow, and the company will simply have a culture that is either more tolerant of questionable actions or at least doesn't emphasize the integrity part, both in who they promote and in how they go after business and so on. So it's the one thing I think you have to build in from the bottom up. And it's very tough to convert a company once it's gotten used to practices that are accepted that are of a questionable nature. Now, you can rebuild the technology of a company, you can rebuild products, you can rebuild almost anything else, but integrity you can't. And the problem is when you have lapses of integrity, if you don't take quick action to make an example of what went wrong and communicate to the organization that this is something we don't tolerate, then it leaks over into other things. Then your customers start noticing it, and then your customers stop trusting you because you haven't fulfilled or stood behind agreements. And over time, it sort of rots the core of the company and prevents you from achieving what you could achieve. Yet, as I mentioned, with Mentor, one of the things I found that made Mentor attractive is I knew that they would look after their customers even when it was very difficult for them to do that because they'd made a commitment. And so throughout my career, I've made sure that we don't make commitments that we can't honor. And if we run into problems where it's difficult to honor it, then we work with the customer in some way to make sure that it causes minimal damage and that we work through the issue. And I think that's, if you do that, and if your organization knows you're going to do that, they'll be more careful about what they commit to, and they will also recognize when there is a problem. They'll elevate it and take action to solve it.
Thanks. And it is so important for, especially when we get into the age of AI, to have ethics and values, even in machines, right? Otherwise,
Yeah,
they'll
that's
do
a
very
difficult
interesting
one.
things.
Yeah, I think the government is off base in thinking they can legislate something that will make AI different from what it could be in a free market. Recognize all sorts of difficulties that arise, and ChatGPT produces all sorts of misleading or incredible answers and so on. All of that, the market will sort out. We'll find ways to solve these problems, but it won't be through legislation. It'll be through companies seeing where the problems are and then solving them through innovation. And I think we're not yet at a point where people can blame their AI bot on some action they took that was misguided. I think
We can't
we're
sue an
still
AI bot yet.
right. We're still holding individuals responsible, and I think that'll continue to be true.
Yeah. One last question. It's been 60 years of the Design Automation Conference, and you have clearly been a pioneer in the EDA industry along with Joe Costello, RDJs. And I noticed that you're going to be doing a fireside chat about the design automation industry and design automation conference. Do you have anything to tell people why they should come to DAC this year, and what this whole chat is going to be about?
Well,
Any
yeah. So
preview?
doing a chat with Joe Costello, and I'm also doing the main keynote on the third day of the conference on the taking AI to the next level. With the fireside chat, yeah, I find it really interesting that the EDA industry and even the semiconductor industry as a whole is a relatively tight group of people. So while we were all fierce competitors when we were competing, Joe Costello became enormously supportive when I was looking for funding for Cornami. He fixed me up with various funds I wouldn't have thought of. Very, very helpful. And I think this has been true throughout the semiconductor industry. The people I've known and worked with in the past, even though they've been competitors, it's all been viewed as, competition is part of the game, but you're all part of the same family. And so I don't know. I'm sure they'll ask us provocative questions in the chat, and maybe even talk about times when Mentor and Cadence got into very direct confrontation. But that's all part of the fun, and so I don't think any the DAC panel will be unrestricted. People can come and ask whatever they want. So if you want to see good interchange, I think it will be. And I hope you can stay to Wednesday to hear my keynote.
And I look forward to it, to see two of my mentors coming together and discussing the past, the present, and the future of the industry. With that, I would like to say thank you, Wally, and to anybody out there. As you know, I love very interesting and different opinions and about what's happening, about the future of the industry. Wally, you've done so much for the industry. It's exciting to see that you continue to contribute in amazing ways. And I don't think you'll ever retire, right?
It's true. I won't. So I appreciate the opportunity, Shankar. It's been a pleasure.